when we're thinking about feeding the world, we're, as we hopefully all know by now, we're trying to tackle a distribution problem, not a production problem. So this is not about how much food the world is able to produce. There's plenty to go around. It's about getting it to people who need to eat it, which is everyone last time I checked. And so the question, I guess, if we want to say, do we need corporations to feed the world, is, well, you know, how do corporations either help or hinder this distribution question? And to go back to another point that Raj made, so we need to think about, well, okay, how is food distributed at the moment? It's distributed primarily through markets, and as we discussed, therefore, if markets distribute goods or services according to your ability to pay. So if you're able to pay, you can have food. If you're not able to pay, you can't. Is basically how it works. And so, if the problem of hunger we have at the moment is that some people can't afford food and so don't get it. The question is, okay, well, what do we need to do to change that? And it seems to me there's two ways we can go about that. So one is to say, okay, well, we need to make some changes to this distribution system or modify it in some way. Or the other alternative is to say, okay, well, actually the problem is inequality, and actually if we were all participating in this market as equals, then, you know, perhaps that would be okay. And so then the question becomes, well, can corporations help with either of those ways of making sure everyone actually gets to access food? And so I just wanted to draw on a couple of examples from some of the campaigning WDM has been doing to kind of try and help us answer that question. So the first example is one that I guess many people who are familiar with WDM's campaigning will probably know quite a bit about already, and that is the example of food speculation. But just to kind of recap for people who perhaps aren't so familiar with the work we've been doing on this over the last few years, this is basically the process whereby a particular type of corporation, in this case financial corporations or financial institutions, basically trade in food contracts in order to make a profit. So they're not really interested in the food that those contracts entitle them to. They're interested in how much money they can make by buying and selling those contracts. And what we've seen over the last few years is how, through doing that, they can actually affect the price that we all pay for food, and how this speculation has actually exacerbated the fluctuations in food prices and contributed to some of the big price spikes we've seen in recent years. And that's why WDM has been campaigning really hard over the last few years for regulation to tackle this speculation, to limit the amount of speculation that can happen with a view to stopping it distorting food prices. And we're not there yet, but it's looking promising. We've still got a bit of a way to go with the regulation, but certainly since the original proposals were put on the table, we've managed to strengthen them through kind of campaigning and lobbying all across Europe with groups based in many of the different European member states. But let's be clear, it's been pretty hard work, and we've been up against an extremely well-financed and well-oiled financial lobbying machine who would very much like those proposed rules to be an awful lot weaker, because if we succeed, and it's looking like in this case we may, at least to some extent, that regulation, which will hopefully prevent speculation from contributing to the food price spikes which push people into poverty, those same rules will also limit the amount of speculation and therefore limit their profits. So there's a pretty direct conflict going on there between the interests of the world's poorest people and the interests of those particular types of corporations. So that's one example. And perhaps the other thing to say about speculation is the these financial corporations would like to argue that actually they're actually doing something useful here. So the argument goes is that farmers, producers and big buyers of food also want to use these markets to protect themselves from fluctuations in food prices. And so the useful thing that these financial corporations are doing is providing someone that they can set up these futures contracts with. And so that's really great. Now, the reality of that claim is that actually increasingly the big players, the people who really are either producing or buying the foodstuffs, actually are not very happy with the speculation that's going on. And it's probably the only campaign WDM will ever find itself on the same side as Starbucks as. So a couple of years ago, Starbucks was complaining that speculators were causing trouble in the markets and pushing up coffee prices, which of course wasn't great news for them. But even if these financial corporations might be doing something useful sometimes, they're certainly only benefiting the other big corporations such as Starbucks who are using these futures contracts. And the reality is that these futures markets don't work for the small-scale producers that feed most of our population. And these markets, these futures markets, are not a democratic way of protecting people from food price changes. And actually, we need to look to other methods. So this might be institutions like cooperatives or schemes like community-supported agriculture projects at a quite local level, or they might be more kind of national-scale policies which seek to kind of protect farmers from prices dropping too low or consumers from prices going too high. And a quick plug, we've got a new briefing which has literally just been printed yesterday about this, which is available on the WDM store. So if that's something you're interested in, do go and have a browse later. And we'll also be producing some packs about kind of these alternatives to food speculation, which will be going out to WDM local groups around the country later this year. So if that's something you're interested in, as a quick plug there for those. So I guess coming back to this question about, can corporations help feeding the world? On the first approach, which is, can corporations help us modify this market system or change it such that it feeds the world? It's probably fair to say they're not doing a great job. So then the second approach was, okay, well, what if we had more income equality? So if people are more equal, then they can compete in this marketplace. Maybe, that might be a way that we solve hunger. So that entails certainly making the poor richer and probably making the rich poorer. So how do corporations fare on that one? And for that we can look at a really recent example, just from last weekend in fact, and that is our government's approach to supporting agriculture in the global south. Now, the government would like to think that this is their proposal is a win-win for the farmers who feed most of the global south and indeed most of the world's population, and for global agribusiness. And so there at last week's Hunger Summit, which was kindly hosted, Freudian slip, by Unilever, they pledged various amounts of money, mainly going to corporations or to schemes that would support those corporations, but keen to explain how that was going to have massive benefits for agriculture in the global south. Unfortunately, the reality is a little different. So we know actually the reason, the context of our food system is that we've got around 85% of all food produced in the world is consumed in the national boundaries within which it was produced. We've got 70% of people fed without reliance on the industrial food system that agribusiness is so key to promote and expand. And we've got a good 50% of the world fed by small-scale food producers. So this is the kind of the majority food system. And the reason that many producers within that system are poor is because of the skewed power relationships within that system. So we've got international trade rules which favour corporations over smaller scale producers. We've got multinational corporations who are able to squeeze their producers in the hourglass that Raj was describing before. And so the way to tackle poverty among those producers is to give them greater power in the food system rather than giving greater power to multinational corporations. And so last Saturday, outside Unilever, where the Hunger Summit was being held, people from WDM and some of our local groups and also around the country were joined by people from the UK food sovereignty movement, community food activists, local growers, people from other groups who share our concerns, such as War and Want. And we were producing, we kind of built together a sort of pop-up community garden to kind of illustrate and remind people that the majority of the world's food comes from not an industrial agricultural system, but from actually small-scale and non-industrial farming methods. And also to protest against the proposals that were being discussed in that Hunger Summit, which sees developing countries forced, in order to access support for agriculture from donor countries like the UK, forced to adopt policies which will actually hand power to multinational companies at the expense of small-scale producers. So policies such as ending the free distribution of seeds, policies like phasing out export controls that would prevent food being taken out of the country when actually it's needed to feed people there in that country. Policies like making it easier for investors, read speculators, to take over agricultural land. So all of these policies are things that are taking power from the hands of producers and handing them over to corporations, and they're all things that are going to make producers poorer and therefore hungrier than they currently are. And this is an issue that we're going to be kind of turning our attention to increasingly as our work on food speculation draws to a close, and it's something that I'm happy to talk about a little bit later. But I think I just wanted to kind of wrap up there and say, not only do we not need corporations to feed the world, but actually the only way we're going to feed the world is if we do something to tackle the power of corporations.